Right. We have a relatively limited window because Tom has to get to an IMAX in Swiss Cottage at sort of some quite alarmingly soon time. So you're going to witness a bit of fairly brutal interrogation. First of all, very quickly, intelligent audience directors, multiple cultural experiences. How many had seen the musical on stage? Wow, a huge number, really. I want to start not on Les Miserables, but slightly on the beginning. Tom, you were an early adopter, I think it's fair to say. You made your first film at least at 13, is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
On film, slightly unusually.
Yeah, I started on a Clockwork Bolex camera with 100 foot of reversal film, and I ran the camera at 16 frames a second, which ekes out about 4 minutes of film.
Were you a stills photographer? I mean, that's a tough way to start, basically.
No, and I think my first film, I had a shooting ratio of 1.2 to 1.
And with a dog, or am I...
It's been downhill ever since.
With a dog?
Yeah, it was called Runaway Dog. And it was
having worked with dogs, to ratio of 2 to 1 with a dog is a miracle, I'd say.
1.2 to 1. 1.2 to 1.
Okay, and I'm going to jump really fast now because I know my time is limited.
We've got some time.
You then went to university and you did theatre there.
Yeah, I sort of basically I was a silent filmmaker for the first 4 years of my life because doing sync sound was too expensive, and I do find it surreal that I have this in my pocket. It's a 2K camera with sync sound and so fast. The complexities of making films as a kid has completely changed. And then I made a short film sort of eventually with sound, which got sort of picked up by the film festival when I was sort of 18 and had a bit of a cinema release. And I went to university and did English because I felt like I'd studied all the technical side by doing it myself, and directed theatre, and then began to direct commercials while in my holidays when I was.
How did you the commercial gig while in your holidays?
Well, when I was raising money for my short film, I figured the only rich directors in the UK were commercials directors. This was the late 80s, and the only people who might be willing to actually give me physical cash were commercial directors, and so I went ruthlessly after, hanging out on shoots, and eventually I met Paul Wayland, who helped me hugely, and so I got most of my gear and most of my help from then, and so that community then, when they saw the film, started to give me
just
some
racking
breaks.
back a second to the sort of 13-year-old film. At what point did you begin to see you being a director was something that you could do as a job, kind of thing, as opposed to something
from the beginning? I mean, from the age of 12, that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life.
And can you remember what was it that gave you that sort of first push into? I mean, most people in the end see the actor first because that's what they look at. What took you behind that to say?
Well, weirdly, that I owe sitting here today to the musical. When I was sort of 11 years old, I was cast in the school musical by a drama teacher who was an ex-RSC actor. And it was falling in love with acting and drama through that experience and doing this school musical 2 years in a row that made me fall in love with it. I also had the experience of working out that I shouldn't be an actor, and behind many directors there's a failed actor. Luckily, I came to the conclusion that I should give up acting at the age of 12, and was very drawn to what this guy Roger Mortimer did in the backstage world, and actually I started doing stage lighting from that age throughout school and working sort of building with light, and it was just picking up a book on filmmaking that sort of opened my mind to that. But I don't know where. I mean, when I look back on it, I don't know where I got the confidence from or why I felt that this could be my life. But it was like falling in love, and
and falling in love with directing or with film.
There's a line in that Spike Jonze movie adaptation where he says we fall in love in order to simplify the world to ourselves, and I don't know if that's what I did, but it certainly makes the world suddenly go like that.
Well, you entered quite a complicated world, but we'll go to we'll go to that.
Yes, okay. Let's fall in love in order to massively complicate the world for yourself.
To the film itself, and to start with some kind of simple questions. How many weeks shooting?
69 days, so 13 weeks. No second unit. As we well, very minimal, like a couple of days of special effects second unit, and we basically, the way we eked out more time is we had 3 cameras every day. We'd always call the third camera 3 hours late, so I could shoot 3 hours at the end of the day with the third camera as a kind of running second unit. So I'd do 12 hours with the main unit and then another 3 hours with the third camera to do smaller pickups, and that's where we managed to kind of eke out
make some people's days shorter, but yours days
much
longer.
Yeah. I mean, the huge irony I found about doing it is, had maybe I don't know roughly 4 times the budget of the King's Speech, and it was quite well budgeted. But what happens is you commit almost all the money in prep to various plans you've got, and then you spend your life arguing about the last little tranche. So on a daily basis, I was debating decisions of 500, 700 pounds. Yeah. Like I kept wanting to run a 4th camera. We'd always argue whether was it cheaper to upgrade the loader or cheaper to get another focus puller in. And eventually we worked out it was £70 cheaper to get a focus puller in, so we'd do that. And it just is ironic.
The minutiae
to me
still.
Yes, I mean, almost felt I got more into minutiae on this than anything else I've done, which was sort of ironic given it's the bigger, one of the bigger budgets. But
you shot on 35mm. Was that a difficult decision or an obvious one?
Well, fascinatingly, my line producer Bernie ran the numbers twice and found there was no cost difference between the 2 routes. And the digital lobby has been brilliant in creating the illusion that economically there is no debate. But once you cost in the digital imaging technician, the fact that the camera gear, if you want to use the high-end gear, is a lot more expensive, and triplicating the backup of that amount of data, it's basically the same price. So I shot 35. Partly, to be honest, out of nostalgia. I mean, to me, when I operate with hearing that sound in my ear,
I was going to ask about the sound. I mean, we want to get on to the sound
and the smell of film stock still takes me back to my childhood. But also, I was being quite rough with the cameras in this, with the battle scenes, and we were up mountains and in seawater, and 35mm cameras, you can really throw them around. They're very robust and they're extremely fast, and I wanted to shoot very fast.
But they are obviously noisier than a digital camera. Was that something that people said, yes, I know, Tom, but you want to do it live?
There was never, Simon Hayes, the sound of course, never really worried about that.
Okay. Just again on a specific thing, what was the first day's shooting? What was the first scene you shot?
Well, again, it'll make you laugh from a budgetary point of view, but the first thing we shot was the sequence in France at the beginning when he goes up when Valjean goes up the mountain and sings that song about freedom at last, and goes to the village of Digne, which is Gourdon, just above Nice. And I'd had a long discussion with Bernie, the line producer, and he kept saying, we can't go to France, we can't afford it. The national insurance fringe is extremely high on French crews, and it's always a nightmare going to France. And eventually I managed to, and we went to Scotland, and I walked up 8 mountains in Scotland and kept saying, surely I'm wasting my time doing a 4-day recce in Scotland, proving that it doesn't look like France. But eventually I managed to work out a way of doing it for about $30,000. Hugh Jackman flew EasyJet, we flew all our gear EasyJet. And in that mountain scene, Hugh looks really exhausted, like he's climbed that mountain. The reason he looks so exhausted is he lugged half the gear up himself, and he carried the lens boxes up himself. So that's how he got the verite of his exhaustion. And
obviously, that was the first moment that you presumably, because I mean, I would have said that is unimpeachably live singing.
Yeah, I mean, it was exciting. I was operating on that pre-shoot because, well, again, just to reduce the size of the crew, and also I love operating wherever I can, and I tend to do something that's slightly unusual in that although I've got stylistic ideas in my head, I don't tend to have committed to a camera style until the moment of shooting, and I didn't totally know how I was going to do that mountain thing, and then suddenly the idea of doing it on the shoulder, handheld, and kind of circling round Hugh felt like the right thing to do, and there was something about something visceral about pivoting with Hugh and being very intimate with him and being very connected to him. And also I had the music in my earpiece, and I could kind of time my camera move with the music, and I started to realise with handheld there's a kind of ballet you can do musically, and even small movements, like if you're just slightly changing the Dutch of a camera or little creep-ins, you can do that in relationship to the dance of the music. And so I felt that was it felt like a great way to do it, and I ended up embracing handheld much more than Danny Kern or I thought we were going to.
But you did that almost that first shot. I mean,
we did 89 setups in 2 days or something, which was kind of crazy running around, but really good fun. And then the main shoot we shot multi-camera for reasons we can go into. But basically, I committed to live singing as I feel like I've said the phrase live singing more times in the last few weeks than is sensible. But more significantly than that, we committed to the piano accompaniment being live as well. And what that meant is the actors, there was no conductor, and the actors could control the speed of each take in the moment. So if they wanted to stop to allow an emotion or a new thought to form in their eyes before expressing it, they could. If they wanted to slow down because they started to cry, they could. If they even wanted to sit and wait till they were ready to sing for as long as they wanted, they could. It wasn't like, okay, turn over, playback, it's 4, 3, 2, 1, Charles, you're late just by a tiny moment, let's do it again. And
but you had to carry a piano up the mountain.
Yeah, we had to but here's the problem, which as directors you'll understand, which is if you commit to live tempo, it means that no two takes may have the same tempo, which means that to give the actors that freedom to make changes in pace, you need to commit to shooting at multi-camera. So you need to treat each take as a unique event where you get all the coverage you might need from that one take, in order to protect the freedom of the actor to play with tempo.
But how do you manage that with your kind of extraordinarily careful avoidance over shoulders? I mean, that you're always basically right in the face of the actor.
You've noticed that. You've noticed my disinterest in an out of focus back of head.
Yeah. But I mean, but that almost is a contradiction in a sense. That are you having to push the actors further apart?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think the answer was, I mean, it was easiest to do obviously in the solo numbers where, but. We did found ways of being right tight on the shoulder of the actor, so that it was like if we're there, it's there and there, and maybe you're short-siding the actor to solve that problem. But I do like to be, I probably shot on slightly longer lenses than perhaps I always wanted to. But it was particularly complicated in things like the ABC. There's a scene in the ABC cafe with all the students where. Each time we shot it, we were pretty much running. Well, we shot the scene in 2 halves, but when you've got 4 or 5 people singing and 3 cameras in quite a tight room, it was complicated. But never have I been more grateful that I directed EastEnders. I mean, because that training in multi-camera directing was unbelievably invaluable, because you're just to kind of know what the problems are and have experienced that at an incredibly fast pace. It was great to be able to kind of remember some of the way one plotted, but. I suppose the real answer is that over time I began to notice that actors would often converge on a certain tempo, and so having given them the freedom, you'd find by takes 4 or 5 they were getting quite consistent, and so I began to realise that sometimes I could break down the stricture of my own design and take certain sequences in a more single camera way if there were a particular shot that I felt was being compromised by the multi-camera approach. So. As the shoot progressed, it began to be a balancing act, and things like trios you had to commit to a playback speed, because it was too tricky to protect the balance of 3 voices if you shot it all at the same time.
And chorale, I mean chorus songs.
Whereas any dialogue duo, to people singing together was always better done live.
Was it one pianist, so to speak, all the way through?
There was 2, Roger and Jennifer, who are kind of the unsung heroes of this, because they had this huge responsibility of giving the actor freedom, but always having to remember that they were going to be replaced by a 50-piece orchestra, and if they let the tempo get too ragged, it would become a complete train smash. And when I came under pressure to not do it this way, one of the great things people threatened me with is, you'll get to the scoring stage and your complex tempo shifts won't work and it'll fall apart. And so they said they had to do this thing of giving freedom, but also driving the tempo on where it became unmusical.
There's a lot to talk about the music, but I just want to get back to that first moment again. That first moment when you're the first day of a 13-week shoot. You've pitched what is, by any standards, a remarkably brave approach to a musical. That you're standing on a mountain. Are you at this point? Are you holding the camera? Are you walking around Hugh? At that point at which you say, "Yes, I feel now how it's going to be." That is that first moment of shooting is a moment of terror. We all know. We all understand.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I find it weird that I don't know why it is that I've evolved to the point where I can be unafraid to make it up on the spot on the day. And I think it came initially. I remember Love Nicole Climate, which was the first sort of big budget thing I got to do for the BBC, that the prep was so complicated, I realised I was never going to get my 2 or 3 weeks to storyboard and shot list the thing. So I had to kind of throw out the idea of having that chance, and had to embrace kind of working it out on the day, because I knew I was never going to get that kind of time. And since then, it's become more and more integral to the way I work. And then it's also grown out of actors. I've done 2 things with Helen Mirren, and I just discovered with Helen, if you kind of go, okay, Helen, you're going to come in through the door because I've got this wonderful shot set up that's going to track so I can see the audience as you come in, and then you're going to stop, and she'll kind of give you a look and go, yeah, but I wouldn't be coming in through that door because my character would have already been sitting here because they'd be waiting for the person away. And I began to realise if you were too locked into a storyboard, you often don't really listen to what an actor's bringing into a room, and so it's become something I've been comfortable with. But actually, that first moment was rather magical because to get in the same shot a setting sun and a rising moon. Yeah. I mean, I'm not superstitious, but I kind of felt...
You felt lucky.
I kind of felt there's something, amazing going on. And also, I could hear in Hugh's voice the cold, and I immediately realised I was capturing something that you'd never get in a recording studio. And there was something about the way, the intimacy of it that began to make me think that, even the idea of doing handheld in a musical is so against the tradition. Sure. I began to find that exciting. Weirdly, the real problem was the cable of his earpiece kept popping out of his head and coming out at 90-degree angles, and that was more of a boring preoccupation for shooting it.
I'm going to come back to the music, but I want to now get back to the sort of the beginning of the process. Did you audition for this job?
I went after it, but I mean, I went after it with an open door. I mean, I don't think they talked to anyone else particularly. But I was working with William Nicholson on another film that I didn't end up making, and he said, "Oh, I've just been asked to adapt Les Miserables," and this was sort of during the post of King's Speech, and a light bulb went off my head, and I thought, how extraordinary, this has never been made into a movie. Also, how extraordinary, I've never seen it. So I went off and saw it, and had an experience where there was just certain moments in the show. I mean, it's been around 26 years, and you could tell it was tired in some ways, but there were these certain moments that were very transcendent and created a very physical response in me. And then I read the book, and I just began to. While I was promoting the King's Speech, I had that 1,100-page book in my bag, and I was reading it on the plane flights, and I got very inspired by that, and I went to the musical 4 or 5 times, and just said to Working Title that I was curious to do it, and met Cameron Mackintosh fairly early, and we just hit it off. I mean, when I said I wanted to do it live, he immediately got very excited and said that's exactly how he would like to do it, and so we kind of gelled in the right way.
I mean, to me, what's most extraordinary is that, in a sense, you take a very counterintuitive move by going, instead of going out and saying, as the kind of the musical sort of says, I'm a film all the time. I can segue from scene to scene. I've got fluidity. I've got scale. And you, in a way, take the opposite route of going into the face. Was that conversation an early conversation, or something that you found on the way?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been quite surprised how much attention the close-up has got, because I feel like, I don't know.
There are 1 or 2 of them.
Yeah, no, but you watch something, I feel like United 93, and it's all, it's all shot there. So I think it's possibly people are not used to seeing singing in close-up, and that's probably why it's got attention. It was actually a quite a democratic process of that process. It grew out of shooting. I mean, I remember when we did Dream to Dream, which is a good one to talk about. My master was a slow kind of track in on a 32mm from a loose mid all the way to a close up over the 3 minutes of the song, which I didn't think was the most brilliantly amazing type of shot, but it did seem to sort of be quite a nice way to do it, and quite simple. And then I ran a second camera, which was the big close up on a 75mm that you see. And then there was a roving Steadicam on a 21, and so I had the facility to edit, because I didn't know it would hold in one, and for a long time in the edit we had this tracking shot, so it was still being played in one shot, but it was a track. But there was a part of me that just thought, well, when she says, when she starts to sing and says, "I dreamed a dream, time gone by," why is that moment less important than the later moment? In fact, the emotion of that moment, I mean, she's just effectively been raped by, or been forced into prostitution for the first time. Why are we coming out? And then Eddie Redmayne, who's been a friend as I worked with him a few years ago, he came in to see a couple of scenes, and he said, "Why aren't you using the big close-up that you're using in the teaser trailer?" And so Melanie tried it, and initially gingerly, and then eventually we just decided to run the whole thing, and then the next time we tested with an audience, the emotional difference was extraordinary.
Yeah,
I mean,
no,
it was unbelievable how much it suddenly became a kind of tear-jerking moment when it hadn't before, and it made such an extraordinary difference to the emotional engagement. And I think part of what it was is that in that song, nothing is about where she physically is. It's all about the man who betrayed her, her lost hopes. It's stuff where the only clue to it is what's going on in her face. But it was not something I thought some of these songs might play like that, but I didn't say to Anne, it's one camera, it's a big close-up, it's all in one shot action. She earned that by being so extraordinary.
She was sitting?
Yeah.
Did you get people saying, "Tom, she can't sit, the lung isn't going to work, she's not going to have the vocal power"?
Well, weirdly, she got very neurotic in particular about, like she needed her feet to be exactly like this, and there was one, it was up like that, and then she made us build a special plank, so she wanted to be extremely level. And one of the problems, I think, with the mid-shot was there was a slight falsity to the position, the absolutely erect way she was sitting, which was disguised by going closer. But no, you can sing well sitting down.
Well, she certainly does. Yeah. Is it true her mother played the part on Broadway?
No, her mother, it's a very sweet story, her mother was the understudy of Fontaine in the American tour. So her childhood was defined by this idea that getting to play Fontaine was a scarce gift. And she would, you'd get the call in New Jersey going, "Your mother's on tonight in Washington. If you get on the train now, you'll just be able to make it." And she'd race for the train and just get there in time to see her mum do Dream to Dream, and one of 3 times. And so from the age of 7, this has been in her blood, but defined as this thing that you're not necessarily entitled to play. And I think that affected her.
And was she an early idea, or did she push herself? I mean, because obviously you can see on the screen how much it means to her.
It was quite weird because when I was at the Oscars 2 years ago, there's a moment where Anne goes down to the centre of the stage, singles out Hugh Jackman, and sings a version of "On My Own" to Hugh, and I'm sitting there, well into Les Miserables, going, is Anne Hathaway seriously using the Oscars as the auditioning platform for this, and also bringing Hugh into it? And I think either I've been brilliantly played, because I did end up casting Hugh and Anne, or she claims it's entirely innocent, and I only semi-believe it.
While we're on casting, I mean, you're obviously, well, not obviously, but you're kind of part Australian. You've got 2 major Australian actors in there. Is that a coincidence, or is that,
no?
Something that you...
my mum's Australian, and I've been going there since I was a little kid. In fact, I flew back there from there this morning, and it's always been really key to me. I mean, it's that thing of having a mum who's always kind of going, "Yeah, it's shitty here, Tom, but on the other side of the world, it's brilliant and blue skies." And as a little kid, you start to have this sense of being an insider and an outsider in your own culture, and that's the gift I got from her. And I think as a director, that's what you are constantly. You're constantly being an insider and an outsider. Yeah. I mean, probably only I would have cast the Australian Guy Pearce to play Edward VIII in The King's Speech.
Yep. Okay. But what about talking of Australians? When you have someone like Russell Crowe, who, okay, he did Rocky Horror Show, we know, but you want to know, can you actually sing, Russell? How do you go about that?
Well, he auditioned. Yeah. Everyone auditioned, even Russell Crowe.
And how was that? I mean, in a room with you and a pianist, that's an audition?
Yeah, and I don't think Russell had auditioned for years and years, and he even, he auditioned twice, like when I first met him, and then he did a lot of work and came back. I mean, he had like a nightmare audition where it was the first one was just me and a pianist, but the second one was me, the original composer, Claude Michel, the original lyricist, Cameron McIntosh, Deborah Haywood, the film's producer, and he had this funny superstition from when he was a young actor that he should always walk to an audition. And on the day in New York, when it came to it, it was pouring with rain, and it was 27 blocks, and he just went, "Fuck it, I've got to stick to my superstition." So he arrived completely soaking wet. So I couldn't approach the live singing dream without people proving they could do it in advance.
Okay, talking of rain, and going back to singing, I mean, so we aren't. it's completely clear why you made the decision they had to sing live, because once you see the film, you realise that that is what the film's about and what they're thinking. But when you say, darling, you're singing live, but it's also going to be raining in your song, what happens then?
Well, first of all, I had
I think you
I look
in
back
this
at it and
instance,
I'd laugh, but I did an extraordinary level of sort of anxiety about whether it should actually rain in Little Fall of Rain, because it did struck me as being a little bizarre that each time Eponine has a song, it rains, and also, you know, you get into the thing of, is the rain a metaphor for blood? Is it actually raining? And eventually, I think Eddie said, yeah, but mate, you maybe just have to accept that it's raining, because that's what it says in the song. But so then we pursued a real challenge, which again, a room full of directors appreciate, which is how do you do silent rain?
Yeah.
And the answer is it's incredibly hard. And we ended up devising this rig where the nozzles were so tiny that the water was almost mist. So that was and then we had to basically substitute large parts of the set for rubberized versions, so that when the rain landed, it didn't have an impact sound. And then everywhere that was off camera was covered in black sound blankets. And in the street scene, it's relatively successful. As the shot progresses, it gets quieter and quieter.
Yeah.
And with the other one, we actually had to put the sound on because it was so quiet. Yes, you end up in these weird. The thing I find fascinating about directing is you end up in these incredibly weirdly practical things of how do you make rain not create a sound? Why does rain create a sound? You know, and then part of me is like, what? This is not what I signed up. You know, was this what I signed up for, being a director? I know nothing about it, but you then have to kind of let go of whether or not it's kind of what directing is, because directing is partly unbelievably practical.
We talked very briefly about duets, but just going back to duets for a second. Even in a conversational film, you would be encouraged by a sound man to split the sound a bit, not to overlap, that kind of thing. Did you? Were they live as well?
Things like the opening duet between Russell and Hugh. Now Prisoner 24601. Your time is up. That was live piano, live tempo. Each take was its own thing, and we cross shot it all. I found it was better. There's a lot of the singing in Les Miserables is kind of like recitative, which is sort of semi-conversational, and Claude Michel would always say he tried to write the music on the rhythm of the spoken word, and so I was particularly keen to give the actors freedom in that.
And if you're in, as you obviously were quite a bit of the time, real locations, do you have to take particular kind of sound precautions? I'm thinking of baffling rooms so there's no echo or that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean Portsmouth was. Where we did the opening was Portsmouth Naval Base, and you can imagine the conversation where you go, would it be okay to shut down anything that makes a noise at Britain's largest naval base, and it doesn't get
no Mr. Hooper.
And they kind of just remind you that you're very lucky to even go there. And but all I can say is the sound recordist I had, Simon Hayes, he's an extraordinary person. I mean, so much of what we did is down to the brilliance of him and his team. I've never worked with sound recorders as fantastic, and he would pull off miraculous work, and I think 98% of what you saw is the live vocal recorded at the time, and that's very much down to him. But we did clever things like we did but we did things like everyone would wear 2 radio mics, one on each side, so that wherever you turned your head, you'd be well picked up. And then at the end of the film, we digitally removed every single radio mic. So you could see them effectively. Yeah. So in the cutting copy, there are radio mics everywhere. Because I realised that technology's moved on, and what was not possible in the heyday of the musical is now. That was like $180,000 to paint them out, which in the context of our budget was worth every penny.
Yeah. And very briefly, in this more choral work, where obviously, or presumably, they can't be singing live in every take because you've got too big a group. How did you approach that?
Yeah, we could handle 50 singers maximum at once in terms of radio. We had enough radio mics. So
you literally radio mic 50
so up to 50, we could do it for real. Beyond that, we mainly had an economic problem, which is that singers are way significantly more expensive than extras, and we just couldn't afford. We'd seen to 200 people, we just couldn't afford it.
Is there part of them mouthing effectively?
So they would, on the really big scenes, we'd often end up doing a combination of doing some stuff where we played it out on speakers, not everyone mind, but then anything close with actors or smaller groups, we'd do it live so that we could like the funeral scene is a combination of all the close shots are mainly the live vocals, and then there's an extra body of sound built from doing layer upon layer of a group of actors later.
I'm going to come to the questions from the house in a minute, but I wanted to just talk again for a second about improvisation and rehearsal. I had a drink with Eddie one night several months ago, and he'd just done the barricade scene, and I said, "Oh my God, how did you do that?" And he said, "Well, Tom just said build the barricade." I mean, we just built it. I said, "What do you mean? Didn't he tell you what to put on first?" He said, "No. He just said build it." I mean, how much improvisation were you able to use in this form?
It's funny because once I got into this thing of musically doing everything in one in order to have the flow of the music. So, for example, the factory scene at the beginning with Danny, each take would tend to run the entire scene, which is about 7 minutes long. And once you got into that, then you start looking at the action sequences and going, well, I wonder if I can take the same approach to that and shoot the action in one. And with the barricade scene, Eve Stewart, my brilliant production line, had lovingly built this sort of barricade in a neighbouring studio to be wheeled in, but on the day, I decided to dress. I got all the operators. We had 5 operators. Got them all to dress up in costumes of sort of peasants and students, and wrapped the cameras in bits of tarpaulin and cloth. Embedded all the operators in it, and the set had loads of furniture standing by, and I just said, off you go. And they basically, these guys just ransacked this 300-foot long set. And there were, sofas being thrown from windows. It was complete mayhem. But they actually built it. They built the barricade in the length of a 400-foot mag, running at 3 perfs, so in 5 minutes, which is kind of what you saw there was done in 5 minutes. And then you kind of go, oh, so guerrilla street fighting actually works. If you can put a barricade up that quickly, it's not a dumb thing to do.
And did you then say take it down again and put it up again? Or
I actually did, yes. I did it 3 times. And the other thing, which was equally kind of nuts, was the final battle. The masters were all shot in one from the very beginning of the battle to the very end, and there was something about, at the end when the guys are just covered in sweat and they've got bits of feather sticking to them and blood everywhere. You kind of only get that. You get that extraordinary adrenaline when you put them in that situation. And also, they were all firing live. They were with live powder, not obviously in the barrel, but in the whatever the latch thing's called. And the barricade they were on wasn't the safest in the world because they had built it, so it wasn't structurally very sound. So if you shoot battles sort of in real time, people's adrenaline's really up, and you get some kind of flavour of the risk of. But I also had my worst moment ever on the set where we started all these one. It's like 10 o'clock at night on a Saturday. And I called action, and they started firing, and then suddenly all my bank of 5 monitors, I heard a massive explosion, they all went white. And literally you can imagine, I just thought, oh Christ, I'm terrible. And I ran onto the set, and there were lots of little fires on the barricade because some bit of powder had gone off accidentally, and no one was hurt. But I then sort of watched the rather lugubrious fire marshal kind of going, "Where's the fire?" But it was all fine.
I mean, you're obviously a very demanding director. How do you find that equation between maintaining the energy to keep your vision 100% operating for that 13 weeks and keeping such a huge group of people working towards that same aim?
It's a good question. I do think it's about being. I think you've got to keep communicating your vision, and because although as Charles has implied, there's a lot I make up on the day or invent on the day. There's a lot I've thought out in advance and tried to get the whole team fired up and invested in the vision. But I also had a really good team. I mean, I had a great first called Ben Howarth, and Ben, I'm sure some of you have experienced this. Sometimes you have really good firsts, but they don't let themselves get emotionally involved, because if you get emotionally involved, it's harder to be tough on the director and harder to be tough on the schedule. And Ben was one of those great firsts who did the logistical stuff brilliantly, but he absolutely stepped over the line and became as passionate and emotional as I was about it, and would be as upset as I was if a day went badly. And suddenly to be liberated from the loneliness of directing when you kind of feel like you're the only person who's driving for more time, for more this, and you feel like no one understands why you're doing it. To actually have a first who did understand was I never really experienced it to that extent, and it was amazing to have.
No, he's a great guy. Just to look at, I'm going to give questions to the audience any second now, but I mean, just looking at your career in a wider way, I mean, going from something like Biker Grove, where you began or almost began, to something like this, do you see a connection between those two pieces of work, or do you see you've moved into a strange country that's completely different?
Yeah, no, I see them as all the same. I mean, even directing EastEnders, I thought I was making a film in the form of a half-hour show with existing characters, and tried to approach it in that way. And the joyous thing about directing in this country, directing episodic TV in this country, is I do think you can have the freedom to operate like a full director in that sense. Whereas I know in episodic TV directing in the US, quite often you're sitting there as director and you have 4 producers around the monitor, and they are literally, telling you what to go and say to the actors, and the directors, and some of those guys become like conduits for the producers, and here there is well, certainly for me, I found there was a real culture where if you want to be that kind of director, producers will allow you to be that kind of director. And you're still, I mean, in a funny way, when you're directing episodic TV, you're navigating characters who pre-exist you. And with Les Miserables, you're navigating characters who pre-exist you. Yeah. You're also navigating, the politics of having, Cameron, who's had a 26-year passionate relationship with the work, the original composer who has a passionate relationship with the work, and you're trying to create a very particular vision while bringing these people with you and getting the best out of them.
How many of those 69 days was Cameron on the set?
Half probably, or maybe a bit more.
Okay, I've done so much talking. Ladies and gentlemen, any questions from the house? I've got lots more, so yes, thank you in the middle.
How did you find Russell Crowe to work with, taking into account that he has a reputation?
Well, I actually had a really great time with him. I mean, I definitely, in the approach to it, heard some of the stories that you're referring to, and it was, sort of scary to approach it knowing some of those stories. But then when you dug into it, there were also some great stories. And in the end, I took advice from directors. I reached out to Ridley Scott and Ron Howard, who I know had both the good experiences and I know with Ridley possibly some mixed experiences. But they both gave me some really good advice. And I found Russell was very brilliant on story. So, for example, the scene, like from the very beginning, he said, my central challenge is how to make the suicide feel credible, because when he watched the show, he felt the suicide a little bit came out of nowhere and was a theatrical device. And even in the book, it's a brilliant bit of writing, but Victor Hugo takes a lot of time out in the moment of suicide to justify why Javert is in this state. And Russell had the idea of Gavroche, of him pinning the medal on Gavroche at the end, and the idea that the process of the unhinging of Javert might start before that final moment with Valjean, and that there's something about the death of a child that might cut through even his inflexible ideology. So I found him a great collaborator on story, and what I found with him was that it was all about walking through and sharing stuff in advance. So we would go to a new set like a week or two out and walk the set, and then you'd always find he had ideas which he hadn't shared, and then you could kind of plan for them. What wasn't a good idea was to kind of surprise him with something and then discover he had a better idea. Partly because honestly his idea was better than yours and you couldn't accommodate it. So and I found that once he'd shared his vision, he'd really stick with it.
Was the sort of theme of him being effectively on the edge in several sequences? Did that come out?
That also came out. I mean, like it was Russell's idea to do the shot of the feet walking down the edge. Yeah. He said, "Why don't you just quickly do it?" And he's he shot so much. He's very camera aware. Like he can walk into a set and read your camera placements, and if an operator's struggling, he can help them. So I found that actually weirdly really production friendly rather than reverse. And
Anyone? Yes, in the front.
How did you and Danny arrive at the photography of the piece? How much collaboration was there?
Well, I mean, with this is my fourth thing with Danny. We did Longford, John Adams, King's Speech, now this. Eve Stewart, I think I've done four films with as well. And what's great with that is you kind of feel like you're picking up a conversation that we left off on the King's Speech and starting from there. What I like about Danny, he's very he's not someone who gets too caught up in saying the camera style has to be this for the whole thing. Like he's quite a maverick in terms of feeling like you can use every part of the toolkit to express yourself, and you shouldn't think yourself into a corner of going it has to be all on dollies or it has to be all handheld, and so we ended up making those decisions very much based on the storytelling of the scene we were in. So, you know, like in Dream to Dream, the fact we've ended up going long lens and abstracting her out of the background is because the background doesn't matter. Whereas in the scene with Hugh, we should talk about the mountain with close up and handheld because the environment is part of the story. And I've also find what I quite like about shooting with more than one camera is, you know, sometimes when you're single camera, you get into that thing of you're placing a wide, and I have a strong view about how I want to frame it, and the DP has an idea, and whereas with more than one camera, you can just set 2 different wides and shoot them at the same time, and I quite like having that freedom to take on a DP's idea and be.
Next question, just down the front.
Yes, I want you to inspire me. I want to know who inspires you. Is there any shots at all that you find yourself being inspired by other people, or?
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of musicals, I would say, I mean, Alan Parker I always thought was, you know, one of the great musical directors. I mean, I went back and rewatched Fame. I rewatched Bugs Malone. I found him very useful. But I mean, growing up, I mean, I don't, you know, it's probably the cliches. I mean, you know, it was Coppola, Scorsese, it was Ingmar Bergman, it was Tarkovsky. I mean, I remember there was a thing called the Film Club that Derek Malcolm did when I was a teenager, where he kind of every week he would do another classic movie, and I think I got my kind of classical film education just videotaping, you know, one film a week and watching it, and got that classical grounding. But I think possibly, I mean, because of my Australian connection, I was certainly influenced by the Australian directors, Peter Weir, for example. I think in terms of that grasp of the drama of realism and the drama of research. If you look at Master and Commander, that how he creates story out of unbelievable research and seeing the drama in kind of ordinary moments that other people would overlook because they haven't done the work of research. I've always found that inspiring.
Yes, over there.
It's a long film, and there's been stories this morning about how films are getting longer, and there's been criticisms about that. Did you have any, I think I'm right in saying it's longer than the stage show, is it?
No, it's 6 minutes shorter. Yeah.
So there.
No, it's weird. I mean, for some reason we've been slightly beaten with that stick. I mean, in terms of the other films out at the moment, The Hobbit is longer, Zero Dark is exactly the same length. But I mean, I started with an assembly that was 4 hours. I got it to 3 hours. After that, it was extremely hard, and I tested it at 2:42, and I still felt it was too long. Getting it to under 2:30 was incredible. It's just under 2:30, and it was incredibly difficult because you can't, when you film like The King's Speech, you can take seconds out, frames out, almost anywhere. With music, once you've shot Dream to Dream, that is what it is. You can't alter the length of it. And a musical is particularly unresponsive to pace changes. And one of the real challenges directing a musical is that you surrender your ability to control pace in the way that you normally can. Because in a normal film, you can take it out of anywhere. Whereas in all the songs, once you're stuck, you're locked into it. You can lift a verse, and you can do the odd thing, and so you have to kind of work out ways of effectively controlling pace that aren't involved in controlling time, which is exactly what you normally don't do as a director. Normally you control pace through controlling the time.
Is there an actual song on the cutting room floor, or is it?
The only song is the song in the sewers which is Dog Eat Dog,
right,
which Sasha did brilliantly, but we just felt that was possible.
Okay, we have to stop there. I'm sorry, questioners, and I'm sorry for going on. I'm going to ask you one other question. Do you see, because directors' careers are so peculiar, do you see your career as something that you have control of, or is it something where you have to look for what opportunity there is available to you next?
It's interesting because for me it's a process. It's about falling in love, and it's a process of auditioning whether you can fall in love with something. And with Les Miserables, because I hadn't seen it, it wasn't one of these, oh my God, I've always, since I was 2 years old, I've wanted to direct this thing. And when I saw the musical, I had moments of, frissons down my spine, but also there were many structural problems in the musical. There were, many jumps that I felt needed solving, and I found it quite confusing when I first saw it. So it wasn't a sort of simple linear process of watching it and thinking, this is definitely my next film. It was more I watched it and I entered into a conversation with myself about whether it's my next film. I think almost it's an example of sometimes, everyone says go on instinct. I think when I saw the show, my instinct was quite complicated. I almost felt like I was being drawn to it like a moth to a flame, because I was overwhelmed by the difficulty of doing it when I watched the musical, and I kind of thought I must be fucking insane to take this on. But what I would say is give yourself time if you can, if you're not sure, to live with something and work out whether you've got a vision for it in your head and whether you can be in love with that vision.
I'm being waved at. 23,000 people on IMDb voted you 8.2, which is a lot of people falling in love with your film. Tom Hooper, congratulations and thanks for talking to us.
Thanks,
Thank you so much for doing that.
it was really good.
It really means a lot.